Alec was the godfather. He took Al along by the hand. Turned out to be a first-class character, and eventually retired after 30 years of piloting.
When I was there were some pretty darn nice fellows, very, very capable gentlemen.
And Ian McTavish, very fascinating character, Ian.
Clyde was a tanker man, an excellent shipmate, a great buddy to have on the committee too.
Jack and I negotiated against each other quite a number of years, but we also played golf together.
Johnny Horn was the money man. He looked after things of that ilk.
We were not civil servants. We were not independents. We were actually employees of the minister himself, the Minister of Transport. And we reported through the old British Columbia Pilotage Authority to the Minister of Transport. And he held our assets, he held our pension plan, everything was contained. And it was a very old thing. I believe it was 1929 when that portion or that process commenced.
I know that prior to becoming a company, there were certain limitations that we were held to. For instance, when you first became an apprentice pilot, you had to sign that you would be available for their beck and call when they wanted you. You couldn't hold any other job outside of being a pilot, and you had to stay in the province of British Columbia even during your leave period. During your 5 days off, this was all we had in the initial time. You were supposed to be ready if a job was required.
January 1964, and I was 1 month backpacking, which was the system we had in those days, and you went with another pilot. It was a good system. You had the right to ask for another pilot to be with you if there was some port or area that you wished to have the assistance or the expertise of a more senior pilot. You had that option if you wished it.
Well, the training had been done over the years by your own experiences on the coast with respect to knowing where you were, how to get there, and so on and so forth. As Mark Twain is reported to have said when somebody said to him at the age of 19, "You're pretty young to be a pilot. You know where all the rocks are?" He says, "No, but I know where they ain't."
But you're supposed to have enough experience without an apprenticeship to become a pilot. The backpacking was only to familiarize yourself with like moving from one port to another or traveling from different ports. That was the most important part. How do I get to these places, you know? So actually we didn't basically change it.
I think I did 27 jobs with various pilots, and then you're on your own, Charlie.
During that period, of course, the Bernier Commission was meeting, and the judge was making a career of that. He was 6 years, I think, which was the longest standing Royal Commission on anything at that time.
During the time that the Royal Commission were looking into events, a Norwegian ship piled up on the rocks just outside of Prince Rupert. The captain had decided he didn't want to pilot, but he went wrong side of a beacon and up on the rocks. So that sort of helped the cause somewhat.
At that time, the most expensive Royal Commission in the history of Royal Commissions, laid a foundation for a new system of pilotage. The government, very much wanted the pilots to become civil servants. And the pilots very much wanted not to become civil servants, with exceptions. Now, the pilots on the Eastern Seaboard have always been employees.
The years from 68 to 71, there were various drafts of the Act and what was going to happen, and the Act, like all acts, went into Parliament and in committee stage changed fairly dramatically. The whole reason for being of the Act had very little to do with the West Coast here. It was primarily a problem of work stoppage in the Laurentian region or the St. Lawrence River. Montreal is very close to Ottawa, as you know, and as soon as anything happens in Montreal, Ottawa reacts. The Act required that all of those areas where compulsory payment of dues was in effect became compulsory pilotage areas. And in our case, the boundaries of the compulsory pilotage areas for BC changed little, if any.
The basics were that they established 4 pilotage authorities across the country, one in the Atlantic, one in the St. Lawrence River, and one in the Great Lakes and Seaway, and then one on the West Coast. So the rules under which these authorities were established, which they were crown corporations, they gave the pilots the option of becoming entrepreneurs or employees of the authority. Well, the push, the pressure from Ottawa was very heavily in favor of being an employee. Well, of course, the reaction to that was, where do you find 350 pilots in a hurry? Because we worked long hours, you know, and frequently 200 hours a month was nothing unusual. And that was in a 20-day period. So under the government's own rules, which at that time was a 35 and a half hour week, where would we find the people?
The Act did not provide any method of dispute resolution. Barring pilots refusing to work, there was no method, if there was a serious dispute between the parties, of resolving them. And this created quite a problem. From an industry point of view, the industry was paying the bills. The industry could not afford to take a work stoppage or even a work to rule, simply because pilotage was such a small part of their operating costs. They couldn't afford to tie a ship up and delay a ship over, say, a 10% raise argument when pilotage was only 2% of their cost.
There was so much being dealt with at that time, of the early time of forming the company and the authority being formed and stuff. Everything was pretty much hammered out at that time. But like you say, every once in a while somebody would come up and want certain things changed. A lot of it was happening back east. It didn't actually, and there were groups on both sides all over across Canada that kind of joined together and say, well, it may not hurt you, but it's certainly going to hurt us in some of those changes. And so everybody stuck together on it.
The underlying fact is that the Pilotage Act defines the authority's responsibility to provide a safe and efficient pilotage in the district. And we took it upon ourselves to explain to them that a safe pilotage and an efficient pilotage and an economic pilotage involved human beings.
I guess the one thing the individual pilot did get involved in and had to make a decision on was whether you were going to remain a self-employed or whether you'd become an employee of the authority. And that took a lot of discussion and in some cases a lot of persuasion to get all the pilots to agree on the one move, which happened. We had been more or less entrepreneurs because we were not on salary with the BC Pilotage Authority. We were always sharing the tariff. Whatever the tariff was, we always shared it. We never knew how much we were going to earn until the check come, but that's the way it was.
If you can imagine the ordinary civil servant who starts at 9 o'clock in the morning and knocks off at 5, Monday through Friday, takes every statutory holiday, his annual vacation, Christmas and New Year's. We work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. When a ship calls, we go. And if we were bound by a civil servant mentality, we could see that we would lose ships to Seattle. We would lose ships to San Francisco. We have to service a vessel when it calls for us. And we wanted that freedom to be able to negotiate those concepts. And we had the support of the industry for that. I mean, the industry didn't want to find that the ship couldn't leave until 8 in the morning even though it was loaded at 2. So that was a big thing as well. Yeah.
When Roberts Bank was first built, Roberts Bank was part of Area 1, which is the Fraser River Pilotage District. So what happened was that the Department of Transport, the Minister of Transport, changed the boundaries unilaterally and forced the Fraser River pilots, under a good deal of pressure, to become part of the BC Coast Pilots. And they were until '72, when the Pilotage Act came into force.
The Fraser River pilots were part of our group at that time, and they were just a group of 7, so they had to make up their mind what they were going to do. And they decided as a small group that they'd be better off to become employees with more security under the federal government. So that's the way we went. We split and we went our own ways.
Fred was the first chairman, you see, Fred Davies, and he left, but Alec McKinnon stayed on and became chairman. And now Alec, to me, was one of the best chairmen we ever had, because Alec got us more conditions and more recognition by the authority than anybody I know. That he was a man that never took no for an answer. He just was a hard rock.
Captain McKinnon, Alec McKinnon, was the president during the time of forming the company, and he did a well job, real good, and so did the other guys. John Horn, Ian McTavish, Clive Lalieve. If you had to have somebody that was questioning what you were doing on committee, he was there, and he did a fine job of it. He kept us on our toes, what we had to do, and questioned what we were doing, and we needed that, as well as to keep our perspective.
There was a lot of hard work and deep thought went into this. And David Brander Smith, who was our company lawyer with Bullhauser and Tupper, and he was a tremendous help to us. Just a leveling, we 4 or 5 of us would be going at each other to beat the band, never angrily, but going at each other, and David would be able to take the whole thing and say, look guys, this is the way, and sure enough, that's how things would go.
The Pacific Pilotage Authority was formed out here, and we formed our company to do all our business with the authority. We made each pilot an employee of our own companies, and then we're all shareholders of that company. When we first started, everyone was full share. So just ourselves as seamen, we needed professional advice and all.
There was always an element of certain pilots who regretted that they weren't civil servants with a guaranteed income. We worked out a system where we knew pretty well what our cash flow was, and so we used to give a monthly salary of 60% of the estimated cash flow, knowing this stuff. And then at the end of each quarter, we distributed that surplus. And that became quite popular, because you learn to live on a monthly income, and the surplus can be used for good things.
Well, that was a very moving time for me, especially because I was still a new pilot at them days. I started piloting in '67, got on the committee quite early, and so, this being a new job and everything else, so to speak, and getting involved in the initial drawing up of was very, very important to me, and as well as everyone else. We had a little cubicle of an office at 1200 West Pender Street, and it was very inconvenient to negotiate within the PPA's office. So one of the directors from Victoria, like Ian, he always took a room up the Blue Horizon. We did a lot of our meeting there amongst ourselves. But if we had to meet with a group, we would either go to the pilots' meeting room in Victoria on the pilot station, or sometimes at the Canadian Merchant Service Guild in the chain locker. We would meet there.
The chairman had to do all the checking all the bills, because we had a different tariff than the authority had. Our tariffs didn't blend, so we had our tariff, they had their tariff, and so you had to check all the billing to make sure they hadn't done you out of anything. So the chairman sat there all day doing it, then looking after all the other stuff that had to be done too. So it was a very, very, well, you took everything up to the hotel at night. Like I was a Victoria man, so I lived in the hotel when I was there. And you take it up to the hotel at night and work on it up there. And so then from that they moved into a little larger office in the same building, right opposite the authority now. And it was quite a lot larger. And then they hired one girl, Valencia. Boy, was she a gem.
It was neat. At first, when I had applied for the position, I thought they were bush pilots, and to discover they were marine pilots, which I knew nothing about till I started. My first day at work, I came in jeans because they were renting a room from PPA, and we moved into our own office on November 1st when I moved, so I had to be ready to pack boxes. And it was fun, yeah.
The biggest thing really for us that are now retired was the pension scheme was changed over from being in government hands at the 2 or 3% interest rates to where we were controlling our own pension scheme. I think that was the greatest thing. And then of course getting some of the health benefits, etc., that we do now.
But the toughest thing we ever had, and that's prior to the authority ever coming in, was talking all the pilots into agreeing to have our pension money moved from the federal government's hands into our own like trust company, a trust company that we then had control of. That was the toughest vote we ever had, tougher than becoming self-employed or employees. The issue was that they were afraid that the money might not be looked after properly, that they now had a pension. It was poor pension, very poor pension. I know pilots that were retiring just after I started, and it was very inadequate as far as the pension concerns. So
The existing pilots, they're still working for the same goal that we were working for. It's for the betterment of retirement. And that's pilotage in itself.
that wasn't a strike. I beg your pardon. We never ever had a strike. It was a meeting.
Okay.
And it was so important at that time that we needed all the pilots together so we could discuss this thing with all the pilots. The authority at the time would not move. They were stationary. How are you going to make them move? You know, every outfit negotiating comes to that block. How are you going to make them move? So we had to call all the men together to discuss it and let the authority know that we were serious, and they got the message, and from then on we were able to negotiate a contract.
We took a kind of steady period to try and appreciate, get everybody to appreciate what we're trying to get through, and that was real difficult, and we didn't like it. We got a lot of flack from our people.
Canadian Merchant Service Guild, we all belonged to the guild.
Oh, I see.
And they had a big room there that you could have a meeting in, and that's where it was held, yeah. And of course, some of the pilots bawled hell out of us for calling the meeting, that we had no right to do it and all the rest of it.
Everybody came to the meeting, and the discussion was, it was loud, and it was pointed, and there was a lot of vehement speeches made, and there was a number, probably half a dozen or so, who members of the group who were totally against it because they didn't think it was the right thing to do.
Again what? Again what?
Again, the idea that we should have a general meeting so we could all discuss this future of our lives. I mean, real future. In the long run, we came out with the right answer, the right end, the right conclusion. Well, that was a long, agonizing process. That was almost 7 months. I was based in Victoria, but I was only back in Victoria, I think, for probably a week out of the 7 months. The pilots had a fairly substantial framework in their mind as to what was required. The people we were dealing with, unfortunately, were not sufficiently pilotage-oriented to understand what the hell was going on. They didn't really know what was required of them.
I know that Stan Clark was the original chairman of the authority, so he was setting up the Pilotage Authority. Fred Davies at that time, who was a Victoria-based pilot, was the president of the pilots group. The actual contract was negotiated prior to the 72 starting date. Remember, the Act had been assented to in 71, in July of 71. So that it seems to me that that period from July of 71 until the 1st of February of 72 was taken up with a good deal of the work in getting a contract.
That is one of the major things for any committee when we went on in my day, like starting in 73, was we got to improve the pension, we got to improve our leave system, and we must improve order for pilots. Pilot dispatches and the requirement for a pilot must be improved. It's absolutely inadequate the way it is now. You had no knowledge of when you're going to go to work. You could phone the dispatcher and he'd say, well, it looks like you've got a job at midnight tonight, Cap, but you could be going to work at 6 o'clock in the evening.
This authority and the shipping industry on the West Coast here welcomed the opportunity to become self-sufficient and to pay its own way, whereas that was not welcomed by the other pilotage authorities. The industry here felt that it was better to control their own destiny somewhat than have Ottawa make their decisions, and as long as Ottawa was handing out the money, Ottawa would be having a large impact on what decisions were made in pilotage. Up until the Pilotage Act came into being, the authorities would negotiate with the Chamber of Shipping and the shipping industry for rates, and those of us who worked for the DOT and the pilotage system would arbitrate or try to get the parties together. After the coming into effect of the Act, of course, the pilots had to negotiate a contract with the pilotage authority rather than with the industry. And it was a good deal more formal process. Then in turn, the authority had to create a tariff that the industry would agree with in order to pay the pilots. My particular philosophy was that I wouldn't agree to a contract with the coast pilots, or the river pilots for that matter, that the industry would not support or agree to pay for. Because it just didn't make any sense. If you have the industry refusing to pay, then how are you going to pay the pilots? The distance from Ottawa is a factor. Quite frankly, the marine industry on the East Coast and in the St. Lawrence and the Great Lakes is very close to Ottawa, and they get very involved with each other, and they see Ottawa as very deep pockets. Whereas the marine industry here on the West Coast, they didn't want Ottawa telling them what to do. So they tended to want to be independent, to want to operate their own system, and I think that extends to ports and the whole marine industry out here. You know, it's a different industry and a different attitude. The way I personally handled it was I would go to the industry before opening negotiations with the pilots and discuss the upcoming negotiations, ask them what they'd like to see changed in the pilot's contract, what items were of significant concern of theirs. And then when we presented a set of demands to the pilots at the time of you exchange papers and all of this sort of thing, we would try to include those things that we thought there was any chance at all of getting. We'd sometimes include some that we knew there was no chance of getting. However, to keep the industry happy, we'd put them on the table. And I'm sure the pilots did much the same process. They would go to their membership, and during negotiations, we would hold meetings with the Industry Pilotage Committee frequently, maybe every couple of weeks or something, and just let them know where it's going, what was happening, and our viewpoints on where it was going to end up. And then the end of some months usually, when we got to a situation where we thought that we'd done the best we could, or the pilots were refusing to move any further, I'd go back to the industry and say to them, look, guys, this is what the pilots want. This is what it would cost you. What do you want me to do? You want me to tell them no? Are you prepared to put up with some disruption if that happens? Or do you want me to tell them yes? Invariably they would come back and say, tell them yes, we can't afford for them to go out. We can't afford to have any disruption. Don't want to work to rule or anything of that nature. So eventually we'd go back to the pilots and agree to whatever we couldn't get work out of the contract. I'm sure the pilots knew what we were doing.
Basically, when I first started piloting, it was, say, tonnage and draft. Draft was also a feature of the thing, and time up to a certain degree. But when the Pilotage Act came along, we then had to establish some form of a tariff that we charged the authority for our services. And it behooved us to follow fairly closely with the type of tariff that they had. Now, the person who really laid the framework for this was Fred Davies. Over the years, developments and improvements were applied, but basically it was a case of our tariff following along in lockstep with the authorities' tariff so that it would be easy to administer. Fundamentally, what the initial stage of the discussions went round and round and round the horn as to what was going to happen and so on and so forth. The changes that we insisted on, for example, the 105-mile 8 hours thing was one of the very, very sticky ones.
We said that any ship that was so slow going from here to Vancouver or anywhere else, it was going to take longer than 8 hours. It must have 2 pilots aboard, so that helped out too. And see, we used to go from here to Powell River at one time, 1 pilot. They'd come in here and get you at 10 o'clock at night, and you'd get off at, somewhere around 8 o'clock in the morning, and you'd do it all by yourself. So we changed that and said 8 hours was maximum for a pilot on the bridge. And
this argument goes on at 8 hours, and what's the matter with 8 hours? So the response on our side, Alec McKinnon, who was a bit of a character, said to the man on the other side of the table, he said, do you spend all 8 hours in the office every day without a coffee break? Of course not. Well, we do.
There were rules that certain assignments were 2 pilots and other assignments were 1 pilot. But there was no penalty to the ship if it took over 8 hours in transit. There was no requirement that simply because the assignment was over 105 miles, they had to take 2 pilots. So those were very contentious items. And I'm not even sure whether those were achieved in the first contract or the second contract. You have to remember, we negotiated contracts every year.
so these changes all just kept coming along, and it was tremendous change, but it was such a difference from when I started. Like, we'd take a ship to Port Alberni, you'd dock it, you'd phone the dispatch, you'd say, oh, you got to stay there, Cap. We want you to take a ship out this evening going down the canal. So, okay, you'd take it down the canal, you'd come back to Port Alberni on the pilot boat and phone in, and he'd say, well, you better hang around, we got another one. And sometimes you'd be up there as much as 5 days in Port Alberni in the hotel. Leave was another thing. In 1974, when we went to negotiate that year, we had decided that we needed another month off a year, and we needed 9 months off, 9 days off a month instead of this 6 or 7. It was 6 or 7, something like that. And this Walter Holmberg, I don't know whether you heard about him yet, but Walter Holmberg was one of our pilots. He was not on committee, but he was a great guy with figures, see. And he come in this day, I was in the Army, he come in, he says, look at this, Jack. He says, I got a decent leave system here. He staggered the days off, and we worked on it. He worked on it, I should say, but we looked it over and run it all through and all the rest like you do and discussed it. And we thought, boy, oh boy, this is going to make it much easier to get what we were looking for. So we took it in, and we had a real nice guy that was fairly quick on the pickup, I think. Captain Fry was his name. Covington was the superintendent, but Captain Fry was his assistant. They both sat on negotiation. So we put this forward to them. We go 3 months off, we go 9 days off a month, and whoa, no way, you'd never be able to operate the system with this, you see. So then we showed them the new leaf system, how it would work. Well, he looked it over, and he was the one that actually said, yeah, I think we can make it work.
Right.
You know, there was only wireless. The ships only had a wireless to transmit their ETAs. There was no radio telephones on those ships in those days. So they would send you a wire and saying they're going to be here at, say, 1800 tonight, and they might come in at 1900, they might come in at midnight. You'd float around out here on the pilot boat. I'm not kidding, float around on the pilot boat for 2, 3, 4 hours, or if you thought, oh, to heck with him, if it was a clear night, you'd lay alongside the dock on the pilot boat until the dispatcher saw his lights coming around, then you'd go out for it. After many negotiations and a lot of debating with the authority, we brought in what was called a 12-hour notice of requirement and the 3-hour confirmation notice. Now that helped to correct it, because now every ship had to let the pilotage know 12 hours ahead that they needed a pilot, or every agent had to let them know, but they must confirm 3 hours before. And so we set it up that no pilot was to be dispatched to that ship until he gave the 3-hour confirmation. And once he gave the 3-hour confirmation, then the dispatch went out. So that saved all this malarkey of coming down here and hanging around waiting to go to work, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So, but that took a lot of, it wasn't one negotiating term that did that. I think it was about 3 times we had to argue that one through on annual negotiations. We always negotiate with the authority, but of course the Chamber of Shipping had their ideas of what was going to work best, and they couldn't see how they could work under this system of 12-hour order. And it's been in operation now for 25 years, and they've done very well under it. So I think it was just like a lot of things. Nobody wants change, you know.
We had always traveled by public transportation. You get finished at a job, for example, in Port Alberni at 6 in the evening, you couldn't get out of there before 8 o'clock in the morning. So you had 14 hours of doing nothing.
We didn't have expenses for local jobs. We had to pay our own expenses on all local jobs. We only got expenses when we went north of Seymour Narrows or went out on the west coast of Vancouver Island. Not Alberni. Alberni, we didn't get them. But if we went to Tassus or Gold River, places like that, or Port Alice, then you got expenses. But not for any local. So that was Alec too. Alec was chairman when we got that one through. So and that's only a year after we became a company. So becoming a company was a big advantage to us. There's no doubt about it.
Prior to the coming into effect of the pilotage authority, the only expenses the pilot received in terms of travel expenses were if he went north, if he went up to Prince Rupert or Kitimat or something. Then his airplane fare was paid. But his travel expenses weren't paid. So the pilots used to travel by the cheapest method. So if we were to send 2 pilots to Duncan Bay, we might have to send them 36 hours ahead of time because they were going to go up by bus. We did negotiate an agreement with them, and we proposed where the pilotage authority would pay their travel expenses. But in return, they'd have to use much more efficient methods of travel. So we increased the utilization by sending the pilot up there in a taxi that took him 3 hours, say, as opposed to going up 36 hours or 24 hours in advance. We took him back from there in a taxi so that he could go back to work sooner. And we chartered airplanes. And we'd fly them home and fly them to places because it didn't make any sense to have them sitting around, not earning any money for the BC Coast pilots, not providing service to the industry when we were running out of pilots. So we did fairly dramatic changes in that line, and we even changed some assignments that used to be 2 pilot assignments. We changed some of them to, particularly Duncan Bay as a case in point, we changed pilots in Nanaimo because this was far more efficient use of the manpower. You know, we were able to get that pilot back and to work quicker. The next pilot didn't have to be dispatched as early as we would have been if we'd aborted him at Brochi. These types of things we tried to do because of the high cost of increasing pilot strength. We had a sort of a flat rate thing, and that was how much you paid. And if it took you 1 hour, you paid it, and if it took you 8 hours, you paid it. If you went over 8 hours, you were in trouble, but you paid a double. The pilots argued, and I think strongly or rightly so, that they should be paid a rate for the amount of time plus a rate that recognized the skill required. And that's where they get the tonnage rate or unit rate, we call it nowadays.
I was back on the committee again 12 years later, or 13 years later, and the fundamental underlying contract that we established in 1970 was still going very, very well in 1983. So that we had built a very good workable basis from which to operate.
So I don't think that they could have established anything better than what the pilots did for themselves and for the retirees.
I saw the benefits that we were able to create for everybody, and not just for the active pilots, but for the retirees and the widows and the spouses that were left.
Yeah, but it's a wonderful life. If I die and come back, I'll do it again, I promise.
Oh, it's been a good life. I've enjoyed it. It's you're at sea and yet you're at home at the same time.
David Brandesmith, he christened me the House Counsel. So if you need to ask any question, if you need to answer, ask McTavish, he'll tell you. When it came time for marine regulations and stuff, ask Clyde, he'll look after it. If you want to answer anything to do with money, talk to Horn.
It was difficult to come by, but and I think the whole industry has benefited by the pilots being entrepreneurs.
Well, you know, the funny thing is, you miss the association. That's the thing you really miss, is like going there the day of that meeting, you don't see all the pilots again. You don't think much about it once you retire, but the association is a big thing. That is, you know, there's a bonding of pilots somehow, and there's always been a understanding amongst pilots that you help the other pilot, that all pilots make sure they look after the other pilot to the best they can do. You know? So it's close as a family, I'll tell you that.
Our new Concord Victoria pilots, Roger 1715, please have a port ladder 1 meter above water.